The dress was the color of old snow, with hand-sewn embroidery running along the hem. Tiny stitches that Lottie had worked through 3 weeks of candlelight, after everyone in the cottage had fallen asleep. It wasn't a rich dress. It had no imported silk, no pearls sewn into the bodice like the gowns worn by the Beta daughters, but it was hers. Every stitch was a small, quiet hope. A promise she had made to herself that this night would be different from all the others. The great hall of the Grey Pack smelled of burning resin from the wall torches, and wine spilled over stone. Deep green banners bearing the symbol of the howling wolf hung from the oak rafters. The banquet tables were full, betas, warriors, advisors, omegas from other packs who had traveled days to be there. It was Declaration Night, the annual ritual in which males of standing confirmed their bonds or announced new choices before the entire pack. Lottie stood near the stone column at the back of the hall, as she always did. Her place there was understood. An omega without lineage, daughter of a nameless dead warrior, and a mother who had disappeared when she was 12. She worked in the kitchen, carried firewood, mended torn clothing. She was invisible in the deepest possible way. Not because people didn't see her, but because they chose not to. Except Dorian. Dorian was the son of the Grey Pack's Betamore. Brown hair, an easy smile, even easier words. For 3 months he had found her near the barn after dinner, had whispered her name with an urgency that felt real, had told her he would choose her in front of everyone that night. "You'll wear something beautiful, Lottie, and I'll call your name before the whole pack." She had believed him. That was why she had sewn the dress. That was why she was standing there now, near the column, with her heart beating in a way that hurt just slightly. Dorian stepped onto the platform when the Grey Pack's alpha, an old tired man named Rolf, made the opening gesture of the ritual. The males positioned themselves, called their bonds, reaffirmed loyalties. It was solemn. It was public. It was permanent. Lottie drew a slow breath. The resin smell was too strong, and the wine at the table to her left had been spilled by someone careless, the sour scent mixing with the sweetness of old wood. She focused on Dorian, who stood on the platform with squared shoulders and a lifted jaw, looking exactly like what he was. A man accustomed to being watched. He opened his mouth. "I announce before the Grey Pack my choice of bond." The hall went silent. Lottie pressed her hands together in front of her stomach, fingers laced so tightly her knuckles went white. "I choose Mara, daughter of Beta Aldrich, as my mate." The name dropped into the hall like a stone into still water. Applause broke out immediately. Aldrich's family, his father's allies, the older pack members who had always known this would be the right choice. The proper choice. The choice that would not involve an omega, with no name-sewing hope into cheap linen. Lottie didn't move for several seconds. She watched Mara step onto the platform, a young woman with dark hair, a burgundy velvet gown, a silver necklace at her throat. She watched Dorian take her hand with casual ease, as though he had never whispered any other name in the dark of any barn. She watched Mara's mother weep with joy in the front row. And then Lottie understood, with a cold and cutting clarity, that she had been a fool. There was no anger. There was something worse. That particular kind of shame that comes not from having done something wrong, but from having believed she deserved something good. She looked away from the platform and fixed her gaze on the dark stone floor, her knuckles still white, the hand-embroidered dress suddenly looking ridiculous in the middle of a hall full of people who knew their place in the world. No one around her said anything, but some looked. The woman to her right turned her face away too quickly to be casual. The old advisor near the fireplace murmured something to the man beside him with a corner smile. She actually thought he was going to choose her. Lottie was not going to give them the spectacle of watching her face fall apart. She unclenched her hands, smoothed the front of her dress with a calm gesture that cost her more than almost anything she had done in years, and began walking toward the side exit, the service door near the kitchen that no one of importance ever used. She was not going to cross the entire hall. There was no need to make this larger than it already was. She was 3 steps from the door when the hall changed. She felt it before she saw it. A shift in the air, something that raised the hair on the back of her neck and made the wolf instinct inside her, small and nearly voiceless as it had always been, shrink and simultaneously wake. It was a scent. Leather, cedarwood, and something deeper, darker, like earth after 3 days of storm. Then the main doors of the hall opened. Not the service doors, the large ones, the oak and iron doors that were only opened for visiting alphas. 3 men walked in. The entire hall turned. Alpha Rolf rose from his seat with a speed he hadn't shown in years. The applause from Dorian's declaration died mid-clap. Even Mara, on the platform, went completely still. Lottie stopped too, her hand still half raised toward the service door handle. The first man through the doors was tall, with close-cut auburn hair and a smile that arrived before he did. Wide, ironic, the kind of smile that suggested he found all of this enormously entertaining. He wore a dark green cloak bearing the emblem of a pack Lottie didn't immediately recognize, but which made Alpha Rolf visibly pale. The second was broader, with massive shoulders, dark hair, and eyes that swept the room with the efficiency of someone measuring distances and threats simultaneously. He was not smiling. He was assessing. The third man entered last. And Lottie knew, without anyone needing to say a word, who he was. He was as tall as the others, but he carried the space around him differently, as though the air near him simply weighed more. Black hair braided back over his shoulders. Eyes of a blue so deep they appeared dark at a distance, dark leather armor crossed with bronze straps. A thin scar ran down the left side of his jaw. He did not smile when he entered. He did not sweep the room with urgency. He simply looked, slowly, with the kind of calm that is not peace, but absolute control. Xander, the Alpha King. The only man in this world who answered to no alpha, because he was the summit of everything. Lottie could not have said why she looked at him. Perhaps because everyone looked. Perhaps because the Omega instinct inside her was more honest than she preferred. But when Xander's blue eyes moved in a slow sweep across the hall, they stopped. They stopped on her. Not on Mara, on the platform in burgundy velvet and silver. Not on Alpha Rolf, who was already descending the steps in a hurry to receive the king. Not on the warriors at the tables, or the betas of standing. On her, on Lottie. In the hand-embroidered linen dress, with her hand still half raised toward a service door. For 2 seconds, perhaps 3, he simply looked. And then, the auburn-haired man, the first to have entered, turned his face in the same direction as the king, and lifted one eyebrow, that wide smile still firmly in place. "Interesting," he said, low enough that only those nearest heard it. Lottie lowered her hand slowly. She had no idea what was happening. But the night, which had begun as the worst of her life, had just become something else entirely. And she still did not know whether that was better, or something far, far more dangerous. The Alpha King did not cross the hall immediately. That was the thing Lottie noticed first. The way he moved through the space without appearing to move at all. He accepted Alpha Rolf's greeting with a single nod, exchanged a few words that she couldn't hear from where she stood, and allowed himself to be guided toward the high table at the front of the hall. The auburn-haired man followed, still wearing that expression of someone privately amused by everything around him. The broad-shouldered one moved to the right, positioning himself near the wall with the quiet precision of a man who always kept exits in his line of sight. Lottie finally let her hand fall entirely to her side. She should leave. The service door was right there. 3 steps, a handle, and she would be in the kitchen corridor, and then outside. And then the cold night air would replace the smell of wine and burning resin, and the particular humiliation of having worn her best dress to watch another woman be chosen. She should leave. There was absolutely no reason to stay. She stayed, It wasn't a decision so much as an absence of movement. Her feet simply didn't carry her through the door. She pressed her back against the stone column instead, and watched the hall reorganize itself around the presence of 3 men who had walked in without announcement and rearranged the entire gravity of the room. Dorian had returned to his seat beside Mara. He hadn't looked in Lottie's direction once. That, she thought, was almost impressive. The completeness of his indifference. The way someone could whisper your name in the dark for 3 months, and then simply stop. As though those months had been a room he'd walked through and closed the door behind him. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm and looked away from him. A hand touched her elbow. Lottie turned sharply. It was Seren, her oldest friend, the only person in this hall who knew about the dress and the barn and the 3 months of whispered promises. Seren was small and dark-haired, a low-ranking beta who worked alongside Lottie in the kitchens, and her face right now was doing the thing it did when she was trying very hard to appear calm and failing completely. "You should have left," Seren whispered. "Why are you still here?" "I don't know," Lottie said honestly. "He looked at you." Everyone looked at everyone. They just walked in. "Lottie," Seren's grip on her elbow tightened slightly. "The king looked at you. Dorian's father saw it. Half the hall saw it. You need to understand what that means before someone decides it means something bad for you." Lottie opened her mouth to say that Seren was imagining things, that it had been 2 seconds and meant nothing, that powerful men looked at rooms and not at people in them. But then, the auburn-haired man, the one who had said interesting in that low, entertained voice, separated himself from the high table and began walking in their direction, with a leisurely confidence that suggested he had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. Serene made a very small, very controlled sound beside her. The man stopped a few feet away. Up close, his eyes were a warm amber color, and the cloak he wore bore an embroidered wolf's head that Lottie now recognized. Not the Greypack's howling wolf, but the crowned wolf of the king's own household guard. He was not just a companion. He was one of Xander's inner circle. "You were leaving," the man said. It was not a question. "I was," Lottie replied, because she had learned a long time ago that agreeing with the obvious was safer than explaining herself to people with power. "Through the service door." He glanced at it with mild curiosity, as though the door itself had done something noteworthy. "Most people in this hall would give a great deal to be closer to the king's table tonight, and you were walking away from it. Most people in this hall have a reason to be near the king's table." The amber eyes came back to her. Something shifted in them. Not quite amusement anymore, but attention. Real attention. The kind that evaluated rather than entertained. "My name is Kale," he said. "I've been with Xander for 11 years. In that time, I have watched him walk into a great many halls and look at a great many people." He paused, and the smile returned, smaller this time and somehow more sincere. "I have never seen him stop." Lottie felt the back of her neck go warm. "He didn't stop," he glanced. "He stopped," Kale said simply, as though correcting a minor factual error. "And now he'd like to know your name." The hall noise continued around them, conversations resuming, cups being refilled, the ritual of declaration night stumbling back to life after the interruption of 3 powerful strangers. No one was looking at Lottie directly, but she could feel the awareness of the room like a secondary warmth, the way you feel a fire before you turn toward it. "Lottie," she said. "Lottie what?" "Just Lottie." Kale studied her for a moment. "Just Lottie who sews her own dresses and leaves through service doors," he said, and there was nothing cruel in it. It was simply observation, precise and unhurried. "All right. Would just Lottie be willing to come to the high table?" "Why?" "Because the king asked." She looked past him toward the high table. Xander was seated now, a cup in his hand, apparently engaged in conversation with Alpha Rolf, but as if he had sensed the direction of her gaze. And perhaps he had, because alphas of his rank were said to perceive things that ordinary wolves could not. He turned his head slightly. Not fully. Just enough. The blue eyes found her again across the hall, and this time they held for longer than 2 seconds. There was nothing soft in them, nothing flirtatious or performative. It was the look of someone who had identified something and was deciding what to do about it, patient, considered, and completely certain of his own time. Lottie's wolf, the small quiet thing inside her that had never amounted to much, made a sound she had never heard it make before. Not fear. Something older than fear. "You don't have to," Cale added, and his voice had shifted again, losing the lightness. "He won't compel you. That's not how he operates. But I'll tell you what I told a young warrior 3 years ago, who was also trying to walk away from something important. The things you avoid are usually the ones that were already meant for you." Serene's hand found Lottie's wrist in the dark beside her, a small anchor. Lottie looked at the service door, then at the high table, then at the door again. The dress with its 3 weeks of hand-sewn stitches suddenly felt less like a monument to foolishness, and more like something else. A skin she had made for herself before she knew what night she was actually dressing for. She looked at Cale. "Lead the way," she said quietly. He did. The walk across the hall was not long, perhaps 40 feet of stone floor and torchlight, but it felt like walking across a threshold, the kind you cannot step back over once you've crossed it. She was aware of eyes following her. She was aware of Dorian somewhere to her left, of the moment he must have registered where she was walking, of whatever expression crossed his face in that moment. She did not look at him. She kept her gaze forward, on the broad back of Cale's cloak, on the high table growing closer. The broad-shouldered man near the wall, the one who had been silently mapping exits since he arrived, tracked her approach with dark, unreadable eyes. He said nothing, but he moved almost imperceptibly, shifting his weight in a way that opened, rather than closed the space before her. Xander set down his cup when she stopped 3 feet from the table. Up close. The scar along his jaw was more visible, a clean line that spoke of something precise rather than savage. His braided hair was dark as cedar bark in shadow, and the leather armor across his chest carried the faint smell she had caught at the door. Earth after rain, cedarwood. Something underneath that was neither of those things, but was entirely, specifically him. His hands on the table were large and still, not fidgeting, not performing, just present. He looked at her, the way he had looked at her from across the hall, except that now there was no distance between them to dilute it. "You were leaving," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, with the particular weight of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "So I've been told," Lottie answered. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement, perhaps. "Why?" She held his gaze because looking away felt like the wrong kind of surrender. "Because I had no reason to stay." "And now?" She didn't answer that. She wasn't sure she could, not honestly, not in the middle of a hall full of people watching. But the silence between them didn't feel like failure. It felt like a space he had left open deliberately. A room with no door yet, waiting. Behind her, somewhere in the hall, she heard Dorian laugh at something Mara said. She didn't flinch. She did not sit at the high table that night. Xander did not ask her to, and she did not offer. Instead, they stood at the edge of it. Him still seated, her standing at a distance that was neither close nor far. The kind of distance that could mean nothing or everything depending on who was watching. They spoke for perhaps 20 minutes, and Lottie would later struggle to explain what it was about those 20 minutes that made the rest of the night feel irrelevant by comparison. He asked her questions. Not the questions powerful men usually asked when they noticed Omega women at pack gatherings. Not where are you from, not who is your alpha, not the hierarchy mapping interrogation that was really just a way of confirming that someone was beneath notice. He asked her what she thought of the Grey Pack's hall architecture. He asked whether the embroidery on her dress was a pattern she had designed herself or copied from something older. He asked with genuine curiosity in his voice why she had chosen the service door over the main entrance when leaving. Because it was closer to where I was standing, she said. Or because you didn't want to be watched walking out. She considered lying. Both, she said instead. He nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something rather than admitted something. And then Alpha Rolf appeared at his shoulder, with the urgent, slightly desperate energy of a man who had been patiently waiting for his moment. And Xander turned to him, with that same unhurried attention he gave everything, and the 20 minutes were over. Kale materialized beside her as she stepped back. He'll want to speak with you again before we leave, he said quietly. We're staying 2 nights. Lottie walked back to Seren through the thinning crowd and said nothing until they were outside in the cold corridor near the kitchens. The noise of the hall reduced to a low murmur through stone walls. Seren grabbed both her hands. Tell me everything. He asked about the embroidery. The embroidery. And the architecture. Seren stared at her. The Alpha King of every pack in the Northern Territories asked you about embroidery and architecture. And why I was using the service door. Lottie. I know. Do you? Because I don't think you do. Seren pulled her closer and lowered her voice to barely a breath. I know things about the king's visit that I wasn't supposed to hear. The kitchen staff talk. And the senior beta who manages the guest quarters was very unhappy tonight and not careful about who was nearby. She paused. Xander didn't come here for declaration night. He came because there were reports. Border reports. Someone in this region has been sending information to the southern clans. Pack movements, patrol schedules, the location of the northern supply routes. Someone inside an allied pack has been feeding intelligence to enemies of the king's territory for months. Lottie felt the cold of the corridor settle deeper than the stone could account for. Who? That's what he came to find out. She didn't sleep well that night. Her small room off the kitchen corridor was the same as it always was. A narrow bed, a wooden chest, a window too high to see anything through except a strip of dark sky. She lay on top of the blanket in the dark and listened to the sounds of the keep settling, the distant murmur of guards on night rotation, and the particular silence of a building with too many people in it pretending to sleep. Someone in this pack was a traitor. She turned that thought over slowly. She had lived in the Grey Pack for 9 years, since the year after her mother disappeared, and a traveling pack elder had brought her here as an unclaimed Omega who could work for her keep. She knew these corridors, these people, the rhythms of this household. She knew who drank too much, who argued with their mate, who was kind to the kitchen staff and who was not. She knew the shape of this place the way you know something you've never fully belonged to, but have observed very carefully for a very long time. And somewhere in the middle of that long, restless turning, a memory surfaced. It was small. The kind of thing that hadn't seemed worth noting when it happened. 3 weeks ago, during the night of the harvest count, when the Beta Moore's household was supposed to be accounting for winter supplies. She had been carrying a stack of linen to the east wing and had passed the door of the map room, the small chamber where the pack's patrol schedules and border routes were kept on parchment rolls. The door had been slightly open. A voice inside, low and careful. And then another voice, female, clipped and precise in a way that didn't match anyone she knew from the kitchens or the lower staff. She had thought nothing of it. She had kept walking. Now she lay in the dark and thought about the female voice, clipped, precise, elevated, and about the patrol schedules behind that door, and about border reports reaching the southern clans, and the pieces arranged themselves into a shape she did not want to look at directly. The female voice had been familiar. She hadn't placed it then, because she hadn't been trying to. She was placing it now. It belonged to the woman who had stood on the platform tonight in burgundy velvet, with a silver necklace at her throat, accepting the bond declaration of the Betamore's son, with a composure that Lottie had read as confidence. She sat up in the dark. Mara. The question was not whether she was right. The question was what to do about it. She was an Omega without lineage, without standing, without a single ally in this pack who had any influence over anything. If she went to Alpha Rolf, he would dismiss her. He had spent 9 years practicing the particular art of not seeing her. If she went to anyone in the Betamore's household, she would be going directly into the territory of the family she was about to accuse. If she said nothing, she would carry the weight of knowing and the consequences of silence. There was one other option. She thought about it for a long time, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed with her hands folded in her lap and the strip of dark sky visible above the high window. She thought about 20 minutes of questions that treated her answers as though they had weight. She thought about blue eyes that stopped in a hall full of people who never stopped for her. She thought about Seren's voice. Someone inside an allied pack has been feeding intelligence to enemies of the king's territory for months. If the southern clans already had patrol routes and border schedules, they had enough to move. The only question was when. She dressed quietly in the dark, put on her gray cloak over her linen dress, and braided her hair with fingers that were steadier than she expected them to be. Then she picked up the small candle from her window ledge, shielded the flame with her palm, and went out into the corridor. Finding the chamber where Xander's party had been housed was not difficult. The king's household guard were not subtle. 2 of them stood at the far end of the east corridor, visible from 30 feet away by the quality of their stillness alone. Men trained to that level of alertness did not slouch. She walked toward them with her candle and her chin level, and the full understanding that the next 60 seconds would determine whether this was the bravest or most foolish thing she had ever done. The guards saw her coming when she was 20 feet out. Neither of them moved, but their attention sharpened like blades finding an edge. She stopped at a respectful distance and spoke before they could. "I need to speak with the king." Her voice was quiet and even. "Not tomorrow. Now." The guard on the left looked at her the way everyone in this pack looked at her, measuring her standing against her request and finding the ratio absurd. "The king is not receiving visitors at this hour." "I know." She held his gaze steadily. "Tell him the woman from the hall tonight has information about his border reports. Tell him they're not historical." She paused. "Tell him they're coming tonight." A silence. The guards exchanged a look over her head, not dismissive, but weighing. Then the one on the right turned and went through the door behind him without a word. Lottie stood in the corridor with her candle and waited, the flame bending slightly in a draft she couldn't feel on her skin. The keep quiet around her in the way that places go quiet just before something shifts permanently inside them. The door opened again. "He'll see you," the guard said. She walked through. The chamber was not what she expected. She had imagined something formal, a visiting Alpha's receiving room arranged for authority, chairs positioned for hierarchy, the king seated behind something large and immovable to remind her of the distance between them. Instead, the room was lit by 3 candles on a writing table covered in open parchment rolls, a fire burning low in the grate, and Xander standing at the window with his back to the door when she entered. He turned when he heard her steps. He had removed the leather armor. He wore a dark linen shirt, unlaced slightly at the throat, and the bronze-strapped bracers were gone from his wrists. His braided hair was still intact, falling over one shoulder, and the scar along his jaw caught the candlelight from the table. He looked less like a king and more like a man who had been awake reading maps for several hours and had not found what he was looking for. Cale was in the corner of the room, leaning against the wall with his arms folded. The broad-shouldered man, whose name she still didn't know, stood near the fireplace. Both of them looked at her when she entered, but neither spoke. Xander studied her for a moment with that same unhurried attention he had given her in the hall. "You came alone?" "Yes." in the middle of the night. The information isn't better in the morning. Something crossed his face. Not quite the almost smile from the hall, but something adjacent to it. He gestured toward the chair beside the writing table. "Sit down, Lottie." She sat. He remained standing, which she suspected was a habit rather than a power arrangement. He had the stillness of someone who thought better on his feet. "Tell me what you know," he said. "Everything. Don't decide what's relevant before you say it." So she told him. She told him about the night of the harvest count, the map room door standing slightly open, the two voices, one she recognized now, one she hadn't placed at the time. She told him about the quality of the second voice, the precision of it, the way it had the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to giving instructions rather than receiving them. She told him she hadn't connected it to anything until tonight, until Seren told her about the border reports, until she lay in the dark and let the pieces find each other. She told him the name, Mara. The room was very quiet when she finished. Xander had not moved during her account. He stood in the same position, arms loose at his sides, watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not disbelief, not immediate conviction, but the careful, suspended assessment of someone who understood that the truth often arrived in inconvenient shapes. Cale unfolded his arms. He and the broad-shouldered man exchanged a look that lasted less than a second, but appeared to contain an entire conversation. "The Betamore's new daughter-in-law," Cale said carefully. "Announced tonight," the broad-shouldered man added. His voice was deep and measured, the first words she had heard him speak. "Which means she is now formally under pack protection." "What is your name?" Lottie asked him, because sitting in a room with an unnamed man felt like a disadvantage she didn't need. He looked at her as though the question mildly surprised him. "Draven." "Draven," she repeated. "And you're thinking that accusing her tonight, the same night as the declaration, looks like something other than what it is." "It looks like a rejected Omega taking an opportunity," he said, without cruelty, but without softening it either. "That is what her family will say. That is what half this pack will say." "I know," Lottie said. "I considered that before I came. And you came anyway. Because if I'm right and I say nothing, people die." She held his gaze steadily. "My social standing is not worth more than that." Draven was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Xander with an expression that was, Lottie thought, the closest this particular man came to impressed. Xander had been watching her through the exchange. Now he moved, not toward her, but to the writing table, where he leaned over the parchment rolls and studied something for a moment, with his palms flat against the wood. "The patrol schedule for the northern corridor was accessed 3 weeks ago," he said without looking up. "We found evidence of a copied document. Whoever made the copy knew exactly where it was kept and had enough time to be thorough." He straightened. "The harvest count night. Half the household was occupied. It would have been the natural window. The fire in the grate shifted, sending a brief flare of light across the room. You said there were 2 voices," Xander continued. "The second one. The one you didn't recognize. Can you describe it?" Lottie thought carefully. "Male, older than Mara. Not from this pack. The accent was different, flatter. And there was something in the way he spoke to her. Not like someone receiving information, like someone checking on an asset. The word asset came out of her naturally, and she saw Xander register it, a slight shift in the quality of his attention. "Where did you learn that word in that context?" he asked. "My father was a King's border scout before he died," she said. "I was 8 when he died, but some things stay." Another silence. This one was different from the others. Heavier in a specific way, like a room after a door closes that you didn't hear open. Xander looked at her for a long moment. "What was your father's name?" "Edric. Edric of the Ash River Post." She watched something happen in Xander's face that she had no framework for. A stillness that went deeper than his usual stillness. A recognition that moved through his eyes, and then was carefully, deliberately contained. "I knew that name," he said quietly. Edric of Ash River was not a border scout. He was one of the king's covert wardens. One of the best we had. He paused. He was killed in an ambush 19 years ago. The ambush was arranged by the southern clans. The candle on the table nearest her guttered in a draft. Lottie heard what he said. She heard every word of it. She sat with it for a moment in the part of herself that was made of the 9 years she had spent invisible in this pack, carrying wood and mending cloth, and telling herself that her father had simply been a warrior who died the way warriors died, without particular significance, without a story worth knowing. "He had a daughter," Xander continued. "We lost track of her after her mother disappeared. There was a search. It was not successful." His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that was not. "We looked for her for 2 years. Lottie's hands were still in her lap. She pressed them flat against her knees to keep them that way. "You were looking for me," she said. It wasn't a question. "The king's household was looking for the daughter of one of its own," he said. "Yes." Cale had gone very still in the corner. Draven was watching her with an expression she was only now learning to read. Not the blank assessment of before, but something that looked, unexpectedly, like recognition. "This changes the question of your standing considerably," Cale said at last. "It changes more than that," Draven said. Xander did not sit down. He remained standing at the writing table, and Lottie had the distinct impression that he was choosing his next words with more care than he usually needed. "The daughter of a king's warden is not a packless Omega," he said. "She is under the protection of the crown. She always was." His eyes held hers across the table. "You were simply never told." The fire in the grate had settled back to its low, steady burn. Outside the window behind Xander, the sky was still dark, but there was a quality to the darkness that suggested it was considering other options. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Xander said, "we deal with what you came here to tell me." He straightened from the table and looked at Cale and Draven in sequence. "If the southern clans have the northern patrol schedules, they won't wait. They'll move on the most exposed corridor first, the Ash River Post." He said the name without apparent awareness that it was her father's name too, or perhaps with full awareness and very careful restraint. "We have perhaps until dawn." Cale was already moving toward the door. Draven pushed off from the fireplace. "She stays in this room," Xander said, and both men paused. He looked at Lottie. "Not because you're not capable of handling what comes next, but because what comes next will be easier to manage if the person who brought the information is somewhere I know she's safe." It was not an order delivered the way orders usually were, with the assumption of compliance, the bored expectation of deference. It was a statement that included her understanding in its construction, that offered its reasoning without requiring her gratitude for it. "All right," she said. He held her gaze for one moment longer. Then he moved past her toward the door, and the room reorganized itself around his departure the way rooms did. The gravity shifting, the air settling differently. At the door he stopped. "Lottie." He didn't turn around fully. "Your father would have done exactly what you did tonight." Then he was gone, and the door closed behind him, and she was alone in the candlelit room with the open parchment maps, and the low fire, and the weight of a name she had just learned was worth more than 9 years of invisibility had ever let her believe. Outside, somewhere in the keep, she heard the controlled urgency of men beginning to move. She did not stay still. She had agreed to remain in the room, and she intended to honor that. But remaining in the room did not mean sitting in a chair with her hands folded while the world rearranged itself on the other side of the door. She went to the writing table and studied the maps. She had grown up hearing her father talk about border geography, the way other fathers talked about harvests and weather, and the parchment rolls spread across the table were legible to her in a way they would not have been to most Omega women in a Greypack kitchen. The Ash River corridor was marked in faded ink. A narrow pass between two ridgelines that connected the northern territories to the lowland routes the southern clans used for movement. It was exposed on the eastern flank. If you came in force from the east before dawn, with the patrol schedules already memorized, you would catch the night rotation at its thinnest point. She traced the route with one finger and understood why Xander had said until dawn, with that particular weight. The door opened behind her. She turned, expecting Kale or a guard. Instead, it was Seren, breathless and wide-eyed, her dark hair loose around her shoulders as though she had dressed in a hurry. "How did you get past the guards?" Lottie asked. "I told them I was your attendant," Seren said, closing the door behind her. "Don't look at me like that. I heard movement in the east wing, and I went looking for you, and your room was empty and I—" She stopped. She looked at the maps on the table, at the room, at Lottie standing in the candlelight in her gray cloak. "What is happening?" "A great deal," Lottie said. "Sit down, I'll tell you what I can." She told her about Mara. She told her about the Ash River corridor. She did not tell her yet about her father. That was too large and too new, and she needed to hold it a little longer before she gave it away. Seren listened with the focused, unblinking attention she gave to things that frightened her, and when Lottie finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Dorian's wife," Seren said finally. "She's been here 4 months. She arrived just before the border report started." "I know." "Lottie, if you're right—" "I am right." Seren looked at her. Not with doubt. Seren had never doubted her, not in 9 years, but with the expression of someone recalibrating the size of what was in front of them. "Then tonight changes everything." "Yes," Lottie said. "I think it does." The sounds from outside the keep began before the sky had fully decided to lighten. It was not the chaos of surprise. It was the controlled, purposeful noise of men who had been warned and had positioned themselves accordingly. Lottie stood at the window, which faced the inner courtyard, and watched torchlight move in organized patterns below. Xander's household guard moved differently from the Greypack's warriors, quieter, faster, with the economy of motion that came from years of operating as a single coordinated body rather than a collection of individual fighters. Kale appeared in the courtyard below at one point, directing 2 groups of men toward the eastern gate, with gestures so precise they might have been a language. He caught her at the window and gave her a brief, sharp nod. Not reassurance exactly, but acknowledgement. "We see you. Stay there." She stayed. The confrontation with Mara happened in the Great Hall, from what she pieced together later through Serene's account and Draven's terse summary, delivered at the door 2 hours after dawn. Mara had been found with a sealed document intended for a Southern Clan courier. The courier himself intercepted at the eastern border by Xander's advance riders before he had covered a mile. The document contained updated guard rotations, and more critically, the location of the King's party within the Greypack's territory. It had not been patrol intelligence. It had been an assassination coordinate. The man from the map room, the one with the flat accent whom Lottie had heard 3 weeks ago, had been among the group that arrived at the Ash River corridor and found Xander's forces already waiting. The ambush had become a capture. Alpha Rolf, presented with the evidence in his own hall at dawn, had aged 10 years in the space of an hour. Dorian had said nothing. According to Seren, who had been in the hall for the disclosure and had the particular talent of being overlooked in important rooms, he had simply sat at the table with his hands flat on the wood and his face the color of old ash. Whether he had known, whether he had been deceived, whether the distinction mattered. Those were questions for the king's justice to sort through in the days that followed. Lottie did not feel satisfaction when she heard it. She felt something quieter and less clean. The particular exhaustion of having been right about something you wished you'd been wrong about. Xander came back to the chamber at mid-morning. He looked like a man who had been awake through a night of controlled intensity and was carrying it without complaint. There were shadows under his eyes and a new tension in the line of his jaw, but his bearing was unchanged. And when he came through the door and saw her at the writing table with the maps still spread before her, something in his expression settled. "You studied the maps," he said. "You left them out." "I did." He came to stand on the other side of the table, looking at what she had been looking at. Deliberately. She looked up at him. "You wanted to see if I could read them. I wanted to see what you would do with a room and information and time," he said. The answer was useful. Useful for what? He was quiet for a moment in the way she had learned meant he was choosing precision over speed. "I meant what I said last night. You are under Crown protection. That has practical implications that need to be addressed. Your standing, your housing, your designation within pack hierarchy." He paused. "But those are the formal implications. They are not the only ones I'm considering." The fire had been rebuilt while she wasn't watching, and the room was warmer than it had been in the dark hours of the night. Outside the window, the sky was a flat gray-white, the kind of winter morning that made everything look honest. "Cale told me you were the most interesting person he'd spoken to in 2 years," Xander said. "Cale has very high standards and very little patience, so I weighted that accordingly." "What did you weight it as?" "Worth returning for." The words were even, unhurried, carrying no performance in them. "If you're willing." Lottie looked at him across the parchment maps. This man who had walked into a hall and stopped, who had asked about embroidery and architecture, who had said your father would have done exactly what you did tonight in a voice that held something underneath the evenness that she suspected he rarely let anyone hear. "I've lived in this pack for 9 years," she said. "I've never been asked if I was willing to do anything." "I'm aware of that," he said. "That's why I'm asking." She thought about the dress with its 3 weeks of hand-sewn stitches, made for a night that had turned out to be nothing like the night it became. She thought about Seren, who would need to know what came next, who deserved to not be left behind. She thought about her father, Edric of Ash River, a king's warden, a man who had given her a vocabulary she hadn't known was a legacy until last night. "I have a condition," she said. He waited. "Serene comes. She's a low-ranking beta with no family ties to this pack. She has spent 9 years being invisible alongside me." Lottie held his gaze steadily. "She doesn't get left here." Something shifted in Xander's face. Not surprise exactly, but a deepening of whatever it was he had been looking at when he looked at her. "Done," he said. They left the gray pack on the second morning. Xander's party rode out through the main gates with the formal acknowledgement of Alpha Rolf, who stood in the courtyard looking diminished in a way that had nothing to do with height. The evidence of Mara's network had unraveled threads throughout the pack hierarchy that would take months to fully examine. Dorian stood beside his father in the courtyard. Not in chains, not yet cleared. Simply present in the particular limbo of a man waiting to discover which version of his own ignorance the world would decide to believe. He looked at Lottie when she passed. She did not look away from him. She did not look at him with anger or with satisfaction, or with any of the emotions she might have rehearsed in a different version of this morning. She looked at him the way you look at a place you used to live, with the clear, unresentful recognition that it no longer had anything of yours inside it. Then she rode past. Seren rode beside her, wrapped in a new cloak that Cale had produced from somewhere with the casual efficiency of a man who anticipated needs before they were voiced. She was very quiet for the first mile, and then she reached over and gripped Lottie's arm briefly. No words. Just the pressure of 9 years of friendship, acknowledging that the world had changed overnight, and they were riding into the change together. Draven fell in beside them at the fork in the northern road, his dark horse matching their pace without being asked. He said nothing. But he was there, and his presence on that side of the formation meant something in the language of how Xander's people moved. It meant she was inside the perimeter, not outside it. Xander rode at the front. At the crest of the first hill, where the road turned and the Greypack's keep disappeared behind the tree line, he slowed his horse without stopping it. A slight, deliberate reduction in pace that allowed her to draw level with him. He did not look at her immediately. He looked at the road ahead, at the winter forest opening on both sides, at the pale sky above the ridgeline. Then quietly, without turning his head fully, "The Ash River post is 2 days north. It hasn't had a warden in 19 years. She understood what he was telling her. Not an order, not an assignment. A door standing open in a corridor she had the right to walk. "I know," she said. He looked at her then, briefly and completely, with those 2 deep blue eyes that had stopped in a hall full of people who had never stopped for her. And in that look was everything that had passed between them in a handful of candlelit hours. The maps and the questions and the name of her father spoken with careful weight, and the door left open always. Always her choice. "Good," he said. They rode north. In the months that followed, the Southern clan network unraveled entirely under the king's investigation. 7 contacts across 4 packs, all identified, all brought before Crown judgment. Mara faced the full weight of that judgment, and did not walk away from it lightly. The Grey Pack spent a long winter rebuilding its hierarchy under Rolf's diminished authority and the quiet oversight of the Crown. Dorian was cleared of direct involvement. He had been, in the end, a man who asked no questions, because the answers might have cost him comfort. The world judged that its own way. He remarried 2 years later, to a woman from a minor southern pack, and if he thought sometimes of a candlelit hall and a dress with hand-sewn stitches, no one who knew him ever heard him say so. Seren became the head of household at the Ash River post, managing it with the same focused efficiency she had applied to 9 years of kitchen work, which turned out, as these things sometimes do, to have been excellent preparation. Lottie's designation was formally confirmed as daughter of a king's warden, with all the standing that carried. She learned the border routes from the maps, and then from the land itself, riding them through spring mud and summer heat, and the first sharp cold of autumn. She learned what her father had known and added to it, because she was not him. She was herself, which was something she had spent 9 years not quite believing was enough. Xander returned to the Ash River post 4 times in that first year. Each time he stayed longer than the time before. He was not a man who rushed declarations or performed feelings for an audience. He was a man who showed up, consistently and without fanfare, and let the showing up speak in the language it spoke best. On his 4th visit, in the deep winter of the 2nd year, he sat with her at the same kind of table, covered in the same kind of maps, and told her, with the same quiet precision he gave everything, that he had been looking for her for a very long time. Longer, perhaps, than he had known he was looking. She told him she believed him. She told him she was not going anywhere. The fire in the grate burned steady and low, the way fires do when they are well tended, and have enough fuel and no reason to go out. Outside, the snow came down soft and permanent over the Ash River post, over the northern road, over the ridgeline where her father had stood watch and left her, without knowing it, everything she would eventually need. It was enough. It was, at last, exactly enough.